Good afternoon, everyone. This is Danny Haiphong. You're tuning into another Left Lens impromptu live stream. This will be on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook. If you're on Twitter or Facebook, of course, head over to the YouTube and be sure to give a like. If you haven't subscribed, do subscribe. If you haven't hit the notification bell, do that. But in any event, I am holding this live stream because I wanted to review the article that I wrote in response to The Nation. So, The Nation and the particular author of the article, David Klein, wrote a hit piece on the left, attacking Child Collective, attacking BJ Prashad, but really doing a smear job on the actual anti-imperialist left and essentially repeating Cold War and new Cold War talking points in order to what I think is the most insidious thing you could do as a so-called progressive, which is channel people's energies into humanitarian interventionism. Actually, so much so that Bernie Sanders' foreign policy advisor, Matt Duss, literally calls for Magnitsky sanctions in the article, saying that they are effective and that they help people. But nonetheless, we're going to go over that. It's a ridiculous statement, but we'll go over that. Let people come in first as people come trickling into the stream. And I'll also go over a little bit about the Kazakhstan situation. I wrote a quick article for CGTN. I'll do a little review about the US's possible role in it. There's a WeChat, the Chinese app, which also does a lot of news reporting. There's an interesting article out of there. It's English translation, so it's not great to read, but I will review some points on it just to underscore how China is thinking about this, given how close China and Kazakhstan are economically. Kazakhstan literally being the lifeline to the Belt and Road Initiative. China is its largest trading partner for the 1,700 kilometer border. So anyway, we will get into all of this. I'll be here probably until about 3:30. Last time I did this, it took a little longer to get through the article. I did a review on Don't Look Up. So I think I'm going to try to give 90 minutes for this stream if possible. But in any event, of course, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell, and yeah, we'll get started. So sorry for a little bit of a pause on the internationalist transmission. I thought that program was really hitting a lot, kind of building a lot of momentum, but unfortunately, it's been hard to get guests. The holidays are a difficult time. People are really busy. And so I had a cancellation in my last, what I thought would be my next internationalist transmission episode. So there was a cancellation, there hasn't been a reschedule, so I'm trying to figure out what to do with it. I've also been writing a lot more, so I have a Substack now, which you can subscribe to for free, chroniclesofhaiphong.substack.com. I've been publishing a lot of material there and kind of getting back into what I really like to do. I mean, this isn't bad. I do, it's not that I dislike commentary, it's not that I dislike streaming, but I have been a little bit put off by the culture on these streaming platforms. I was flirting maybe with a TikTok. No, I mean, I have a TikTok, but I was flirting a little bit with Twitch, maybe Rockfin. But I decided if I'm going to be a singular person working on this kind of material, working on political education, then I really need to focus on what I'm most effective at. And I've been doing that with my writing. So in any event, yes, I am a one-person operation when it comes to these things. So that's why I've been trying to raise an income so I can maybe even get some help. That's another goal maybe in the distant future. Some production help maybe. So if you can subscribe at patreon.com/Danny Haiphong and just assist in whatever you can financially. These are hard times. A lot of people have unfortunately had to go and take care of their needs, which I totally understand. But that's why we plug, patreon.com/Danny Haiphong. But I'm not going to spend much time on this. I want to get started so this can be completed in a timely manner. I have been staying a little bit away from domestic politics of late. It's been kind of a mess in the United States domestically. I'm sure you've seen these viral tweets that are going around of Kamala Harris being interviewed on NBC and essentially saying, when asked about whether the Biden administration should change course, she says, oh, well, we're going to be doing what we've always been doing, and that time is right now. It's this really word salad, just gobbledygook. I mean, it just shows where the ruling class is right now, where the Democratic Party is, where the duopoly is. It's really in a state of political stagnation. So I haven't really been up. There really isn't much happening in that regard that is worth repeating over and over and over again. So the Nation, thankfully, so I thank the Nation for publishing the filth that it did. The Nation published this article by David Clion, which I think was worth paying attention to because it was an obvious attempt to attack the left in a manner that seemed objective, that seemed quote unquote journalistic. He claimed he wasn't a China expert at all, which is interesting because he decided to write a whole article about the debate around China on the left, supposedly. And what you will see as I go through my article, you'll see how, interestingly enough, somehow, some way, the neither Washington nor Beijing, the stance, the new Cold War stance that has its roots in the old Cold War of neither Washington nor Moscow, this sort of position that the left, or some sections of the left, a large majority of the left took, which saw both the Soviet Union and the United States as equally oppressive, not worth supporting on either side. That's essentially what this article is advocating. And some might say, well, at least it's opposing the US's military aggression, but it doesn't. And that's also what is very interesting. And I'll get to that in the article and how I talk about these forces are always looking, right? These Western leftists, they're always looking to organize people into an anti-China position, but rarely, if ever, are they interested in organizing people into a pro-peace position. And anyway, we'll get into that. But it's really good to be with all of you this afternoon. We got a good hour, 20 minutes or so to do this. So let me share my screen again. If you're on Facebook, if you're on Twitter, make sure to come to the YouTube, hit the like, hit the subscribe, hit the notifications buttons. All right. So here we go. I'm going to share my screen. All right, here we go. So, how to satisfy the American empire, smear the left, demonize China. And I talk about how a recent report in The Nation magazine accomplishes both by inducing readers with a steady dose of Cold War leftism and condemnation of those critical of the empire's narrative, people like myself, people like Chow Collective, people like Vijay Prashad. And this whole article is really a hit piece on people like us, which means we need to pay attention because this is all about organizing liberals, organizing social democrats to, instead of join us in a pro-peace campaign, in a campaign to stop U.S. aggression toward China, which is what we can control. It's all about how to get the U.S. to do something. So affiliating us with the United States and getting us to act on China and its political and social and economic processes, despite the fact that we have no control over those processes, and we should not be swallowing wholesale the lies of the U.S. establishment, the U.S. foreign policy blob. That is the bare minimum of what a real left should be doing. And so this article is not serious about that. And so, as I said before, many on the left, as you may all well know, view China and the United States as kind of these equal powers, sometimes competing a lot of times collaborating in order to create this oppressive reality that we live in. But nothing could be further from the truth, despite the US and China's close ties. So there is a historic trend when it comes to this worldview that China and the US are equally bad. We're not going to support China. We're not going to see it as socialist. We're going to see it as an imperialist country, just like the United States, but different in character. That dates back to the Cold War, when McCarthyism, when anti-communism, this vicious assault on the socialist movement domestically and globally, led by the United States and its Western allies, when that succeeded in co-opting certain sections of the left, but really diverting them, infiltrating and organizing this kind of counterinsurgency against actually existing socialism, and getting the liberal class to essentially become foot soldiers in the Cold War. And that's what this article attempts to do in the new Cold War. It's all about helping Washington and the imperialist powers maintain their hegemony through humanitarian interventionism. So again, the author David Klein in this article, he concludes that leftists are divided into two camps on the question of China. And so he calls people like myself, quote unquote, apologists who prioritize peace versus those critics who prioritize, quote unquote, human rights. So you can't have both. You have to essentially choose one. And I'll get to that because this article doesn't even mention the word peace in it. It doesn't talk about ending hostilities, despite in one sentence saying something like, everyone I talk to agrees that increasing hostilities between the two countries would be a disaster. And that's it. That's the pro-peace position, according to David Klein. It's really just incredibly insulting. So he closes with many citations, but a final citation from Lausan, a collective that supposedly supports a quote-unquote decolonial framework on Hong Kong and issues of global imperialism. However, Lausan has spent a lot of time, and they have a lot of members in the DSA that spend a lot of time attacking Chow Collective. It's a very strange phenomenon. It's so unhelpful. And again, it's this kind of social imperialist attitude, this so-called leftist imperialist attitude, where you're looking at everything nihilistically and saying everything's all bad. We need to oppose all of it. We have no hope in this game for peace, so we need to rail against China. And actually, Lausan rails against China much more than it does the United States, if you take a look at their work. But again, they characterize people like Chow Collective as tankies or fascists. And in this article, as I will mention later, David Klein actually uses the word tanky 6 times. It's 6 times. He uses it more than the word military in an article about the US and China, which to me, I don't know how you can do unless you have an obvious political agenda, which Klein obviously does. And you can tell this by his political affiliations, right? So David Klein is an editor for Jewish Currents, which is supposedly this left magazine in the Jewish left movement. If you look at the work, it's mostly kind of like a liberal magazine. It's almost like The Nation in terms of its political content, its orientation ideologically, really liberal, sort of comes out of that New Deal type orientation. But if you look at some of the articles that have been written about, let's say, Syria, you can see that, again, this pro-imperialist mentality is just so pervasive. And David Klein has published articles in this magazine as a newsletter editor that compare Syria to the Holocaust. And of course, Bashar al-Assad is Hitler in this case. And so it's a very State Department-esque position. So it should come as no surprise that with China, someone out of Jewish Currents would do no better, given that this is the position, that it's a very liberal, right-wing neocon position. Assad is Hitler, Syria is the Holocaust, so we have to do something. And actually, this in 2013, Jewish currents came out on the side of a no-fly zone, advocating for the United States to essentially bomb President Bashar al-Assad out of power, which was generally a mainstream position on the left. So similar to Libya in 2011, where a lot of the left got behind the US and NATO's, Turkey's, the Gulf countries, Israel, their support for a no-fly zone to overthrow Muammar Gaddafi, Jewish currents supported, and I didn't go as far back as 2011, so I don't even want to know about their position on Libya, but they supported a no-fly zone. And then David Klein himself has commented on the new Cold War in the past, and with regard to Russia. And what's really insidious, and I think we all have to recognize how insidious this is because you can recognize when, right, if you have an anti-imperialist or anti-war leanings, if you have sort of these progressive leanings, like a lot of these left-ish kind of folks that are trying to figure out their way around the word socialism, trying to figure out where they stand on these issues, then what's really insidious about this is that David Klein speaks in an article he wrote in 2018 for The Nation. He kind of speaks this language of humanitarianism, human rights, this equivocation between the United States and those countries that are big enough and quote unquote bad enough for him to make this false equivalency over. So he does this with Russia, and he argues, and I kid you not, he argues that leftists should advocate for normalization, but not necessarily on terms of peace, but essentially to make imperialism more effective by infiltrating that society and making it more like the United States. I kid you not, this is his argument, that normalization will allow Russia to open up to the United States, and the United States can then essentially topple the corrupt elements, aka Vladimir Putin, aka anyone that the United States doesn't like. And what does that really mean? And we'll get into this with Kazakhstan later. What does that mean other than a call for war by other means, right? It's really calling for soft power, which always leads to hard power. It always leads to destabilization. It's cynical, it's disingenuous, but really it's the epitome of the imperialistic mentality, this warmongering mentality, which can somehow spin normalization as a mechanism for interfering in Russia's affairs based on human rights. And that's essentially what he argues progressives should do. And David Klein is no progressive because, as we've been talking about for many years, since 2015-16, well, really 2016-17, I should say, Russiagate has exposed a lot of folks who consider themselves progressives or even liberal as just plain out neocons. And that's what David Klein is. You can go into the article, look at the tweets of him essentially obnoxiously. Let me see if I can pull it up. Now it goes to another screen. But you can pull it up in the article. Essentially, David Klein supports Russiagate and is pretty hostile to anyone who questions it. And he deleted all these tweets. And we don't need to go into the tweets unless you all want to. But so moving on, David Klein is not a serious person. But he is serious in the sense that he has a job to do. And his job is, in this article in particular, to dress up an imperialist mindset, an imperialist mentality, dress up Western chauvinism, dress up the humanitarian interventionist war on China, this new Cold War, and dress it up in ways that will convince leftists who are trying to figure things out. And that's why he focuses so much on Lausanne and so much on the social democratic forces, because it's obvious that he wants those forces to be at the forefront of where people go when they want to learn more about China. And that's what makes this so dangerous. So he asks, right, the title of the article is, what should the left do about China? I mean, that is just screams Western chauvinism. What do you mean, what should the left do about China? China is a sovereign country. China is the second largest, will be the largest economy in the world. China doesn't need Western leftist help in figuring out its own situation, its own internal contradictions. Nonetheless, that's the question. And so it really does scream this do-gooder spirit, this almost NGO-like spirit, this nonprofit spirit of, yeah, we're going to do good, we're going to save China. That's the title. And that's, you know, major publications, not sure if the Nation does this, but major publications go have entire sets of staff dedicated to headlines. And I'm not sure about the Nation. Maybe it does. Not a great use of money, probably for what is a magazine like the Nation, which is declining in popularity. But nonetheless, that headline says something and is meant to evoke something. So, you know, we have so much of Lao San in this article, ranting about quote unquote tankies, ranting about disagreements with the DSA's position, because the DSA right now is trying to figure out, and there are good people in the International Committee who I know who are trying to push a pro-peace position, and there's a lot of conflict. Some view it as, well, we should not go along with the human rights narrative because that gives cover for imperialism, because that only helps push forward these very damaging new Cold War policies like the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act that was just passed last month, which essentially bans all imports from Xinjiang to the United States. That's a heavy sanctions regime based on this human rights narrative. And so some in DSA are saying, no, we're not going to support that. We're not going to give wholesale agreement to that. Well, there are others who like those in Lao San, people like Promise Lee, who want that, who want China to be condemned at all costs and really be the principal contradiction to confront. And to me, that's just so, that's just so off. But moving on, curtail war too. Although that's a little generous by me. It doesn't say you can curtail war in this, but essentially it's saying you can advocate for more peaceful relations between the US and China while also criticizing the Chinese government. Well, most people do that, except without the advocating for peaceful relations between the two countries. So it's just interesting that there is this knee-jerk reaction to get people to want to take that position. So Klein, he attempts to build credibility for his arguments by going through a host of quotes, because this is all what the article is about. It's all about quotes. It's all about getting folks from the quote unquote left to talk about China and talk about what the left should do about China. So Soros and Koch-funded Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft is cited in this, essentially stating that, well, it's not really about whether China and the US are good actors, but what is the US going to do about it, right? That's literally what the Quincy Institute representative says, or at least former Quincy Institute representative says. But yes, George Soros and Charles Koch started this NGO, this think tank, which essentially poses almost as like an anti-regime change, anti-war think tank. But it's really all about promoting a less militarist approach to US imperialism and promoting a more there's a section of the ruling class that wants to see a little bit more diplomacy from the United States. So wielding the smart stick rather than just the big stick. And that's what the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft is all about. That's why Soros and Koch are so interested in it, started it, funded to the tune of millions of dollars. You also have Bernie Sanders as foreign policy advisor, Matt Duss, and then the academic-driven Justice is Global movement. Matt Duss, as I said before, comes out in favor of the Magnitsky Act sanctions, which are supposedly targeted sanctions on government officials, governments, government institutions. Now, Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, congratulations to the Nicaraguan people, to the FSLN. Margaret Kimberly was there. Hopefully we can get together and talk about that. She met Daniel Ortega, which is great. We had a lot of cool journalists out there, friends of mine, Dan Kovalik, Camila Escalante, just Ben Norton, really cool people out there covering that. And Daniel Ortega has been very clear. These sanctions hurt the economies of the countries. They cause suffering that these sanctions are leveled upon. They cause massive damage to economic institutions, especially for governments where there is a higher degree of state intervention in the economy. And so if you're on the opposite end of that spectrum, then maybe Magnitsky sanctions won't help you, but won't hurt you, but you're likely not to have those sanctions because your economy is already so opened up and essentially privatized and under the global financial capitalist regime, unlike a country like Nicaragua and China and others, which still have large amounts of state intervention in their economies, which is really the reason why there are sanctions in the first place, is to starve those countries and to attempt to isolate them economically, politically, and otherwise. So this Justice is Global movement of, well, let's just say Matt Duss. I've seen his review on Max Blumenthal's book. I've seen his statements. He is the prototype of this pseudo-socialist, pro-imperialist left, calling for sanctions. I mean, that's a criminal act of war. It has killed tens of thousands of people in Venezuela alone. It has killed so many people, caused so much hardship. And here he is asking for targeted sanctions against China because it'll help the Uyghurs. Well, he obviously hasn't been reading much because, well, livelihoods haven't, China takes care of these issues and tries to maneuver around them, but these sanctions are actually creating a situation where the livelihoods of cotton growers, of workers in Xinjiang are potentially threatened, and Matt Duss doesn't seem to care. But the Justice Global movement, it seems to be a consortium of DSA type folks, master's degrees, academics, young academics, and they have a whole report, I kid you not. They have a whole report on how to engage anti-Asian racism while learning how to make legitimate criticisms of China. And they give you a whole, you can go on the article, click on the report if you want. I don't recommend reading it necessarily, but it goes by in these charts one by one. Here's how you recognize anti-Asian racism as being cloaked in anti-China sentiment and politics versus here's how you criticize the Chinese government. You make targeted criticisms, that sort of thing. You disassociate the government with the people. I mean, it just feels so disgusting when you read it because you know, if you've been following these things, that such a mentality only helps to bolster imperialism because it gets us to focus on bad China over there while not being able to understand the larger geopolitical implications for why there's so much hostility towards China in the first place on the part of the United States. So David Klein in this article engages in a lengthy smear campaign of the Chow Collective, a group of Chinese diaspora activists who publish educational material that counters new Cold War propaganda against China. I've worked with Chow Collective in the past, been involved in many events with them. They're good people. They are smart people. They do their homework, and they get viciously attacked for being unapologetically in solidarity with China's socialist process. And that's not something that's easy to do in this kind of political climate, especially as people in the Chinese diaspora. So, Lao San is really the machine gun pointed at Chow Collective in the article, constantly talking about how Chow Collective is sowing discord on the left. It's a tanky organization. It's just all sorts of condemnations and criticisms, which are bad faith. Doesn't engage at all with the politics of Chow Collective beyond just saying that there were a couple of things, but I mentioned one. Clion talks about how Chow Collective came out against Hong Kong protests as being connected with the former colonizers. And then he moves on to the issue of quote unquote human rights in China's Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. It's really very intellectually lazy. And so one of my subscribers on Patreon actually brought this up, and I think it's a good point. He said that maybe I should have included in this article human rights statistics, what the real situation in Xinjiang is like. Surely that is, I think, a good suggestion, and maybe I'll incorporate some of that here. But essentially what Clion does is he ignores all of that. And he even ignores what the so-called tanky, quote-unquote, leftists are actually saying or misrepresents them. So he dismisses the report, the 18,000-word resource list that Chow Collective made. He dismisses it as just claiming that reports coming out of Xinjiang by the mainstream press, by even some of these lefties, so-called lefties, is just atrocity propaganda. And then he moves on to Vijay Prashad and essentially misrepresents what he says, attempts to kind of make it, I mean, it was just a very confusing paragraph. You all can read it for yourself, but Vijay Prashad, he clarified his comments to me in a quote. Essentially, there was a few things in question, it seemed. One of them was there was this vague pull quote that he used, Clion, saying that Vijay Prashad did not believe in cultural genocide, that he's not sympathetic to it. And he didn't make reference to how he was talking about in this case of China, that the cultural genocide narrative is not something he's sympathetic to because, as you'll see later in the quote, because anti-poverty work, poverty alleviation, there is a connection between culture and economics. So culture actually does change when your economic situation changes for the better. And that does not mean an elimination of all culture. It just means that old forms of culture that stemmed from this kind of depravity, extreme poverty, that is what is eradicated. So they didn't get that. They couldn't make those distinctions. David Klein couldn't make it. The editors, whoever edited his article, couldn't get it. And instead, made it seem like Vijay Prashad was comparing China's situation to the UK, to the United States, as a colonial situation, saying, well, colonialists bring progressive things too. That's essentially what David Klein tries to frame Vijay Prashad's comments as being all fours, essentially co-signing. It's absolutely disgusting. But here's Vijay Prashad's quote to me. He said, any project of a people must have the right to advance its own understanding of their struggles. We have to ask the question, is it acceptable in China to advance the well-being of people and eliminate poverty? Furthermore, the article accepts that Chinese colonialism is a reality in Xinjiang. That's a debatable premise, in my opinion. I would like to see David speak on these issues. And so for me, it's not even debatable. There's no Chinese colonialism, right? There's no settler colonialism. There's no occupation. There's no usurping land, displacing indigenous nations, slaughtering them, right? If China was slaughtering people in the millions across the East Asia and Central Asia region, best believe the United States would have something to say about it, and they would have a front row view of it, given that the United States has 400 military bases in the Asia Pacific. And this isn't mentioned in the article, the US flies literally hundreds, if not thousands, of spy planes over China and South China Sea alone over the course of a given year. So I think that there would be a lot of verifiable evidence if China was committing some sort of colonial genocide in its region. So, yes, Klein doesn't address any of these issues, but he counters the Chow Collective and Vijay Prashad's position on Xinjiang very curiously by citing a so-called leftist. I guess this isn't the left anymore, but Rahat Hassan, who's a human rights lawyer, quote unquote, but really a senior resident fellow at the Strategic Litigation Center at the Atlantic Council, which is NATO's think tank. It was founded by NATO. And its affiliates, you can see on the website if you want how confusing that is, but it just says our citizen groups founded it. It was NATO. Anywho, the NATO is funded by Wall Street, and I mean, not NATO. The Atlantic Council is funded by Wall Street banks, corrupt governments, Goldman Sachs, United Arab Emirates. It's not a legitimate resource for any kind of information. It really is a propaganda apparatus. It's a think tank that's meant to spread far and wide NATO's designs, geopolitical designs for the world. So anyway, the article goes on and on about human rights in China, what the DSA's internal debate says about how to approach human rights claims without supporting China, pro-interventionist positions. That's the debate, right? How to do that. How do you approach China's human rights claims without supporting a pro-interventionist position? That's the debate in the DSA, as I said earlier. And essentially what Klein does is he reduces the question of what the left, of what position the left should take on China by how the US should confront China. So rather than talking about a real left position, doing some investigation about China's internal contradictions, what is China like, what is China doing on the foreign policy front, what is it doing on the domestic policy front, how should we approach that in a manner that is about solidarity and about anti-imperialism rather than about how to change China. That's not what this article is about. So the dangers of imperialist aggression and the questionable claims about China are marginalized or ignored. The claims are not talked about at all. And it's clear that Klein's position is, and he says this, that if the US left does not lead the way in condemning China, then Mike Pompeo and the far right will. On the question of human rights, he poses it as, but really what he's talking about is if you allow far right actors like Mike Pompeo to be the face of the crusade over human rights in China, then the left is losing. When in reality, you're the one who's losing if you are mimicking Mike Pompeo, right? If you are speaking like and acting like Mike Pompeo, then maybe you should do some self-reflection, right? If you're a so-called leftist and have the same position as him when it comes to these questions on China. So, I mean, the logic is simple here. And it makes sense that Klein would try to give an ideological boost to those leftists who support this propaganda against China, this new Cold War propaganda. If you say something positive about China, then you're a quote unquote tanky. If you question the Western and US narrative on issues like Hong Kong, Xinjiang, or any of the so-called human rights issues, then you are also a tanky. And if you oppose US sanctions, which threaten the livelihoods of people in Xinjiang, then congratulations, you are also nothing but a tanky. So the fact that Klein's article refers to the word tanky 6 times, I think says all we need to know about what kind of maturity level Klein is working from and how none of this belongs in an anti-imperialist movement, let alone a piece of journalism like this is supposed to be. So any concession to anti-China propaganda is a gift to the American empire. And that's just objective facts. We can look at how these concessions operate. We can see that they take the form of omitting US aggression against China. So in this article, literally not one data point, not one explanation, not one detail of US policy towards China. There's a little bit of like, there's military, economic, diplomatic conflicts between the US and China. But no mention of the sanctions except for our boy Matt Duss, literally calling for sanctions against China. There's no mention of the already existing sanctions against China. We can also see how the slander of those critical of humanitarian interventionism and claims of genocide in China made by dubious sources is another concession, which this article makes. And then a total rejection of China's political and social processes as quote unquote authoritarian, which again, this article also subscribes to. So again, this article avoids very specific realities, which if we don't understand, if we don't have knowledge of, then we don't understand the true character of U.S.-China relations at this point, why they have soured. U.S. militarism in the Pacific, 400 military bases, the occupation of Okinawa, right? The thousands of troops in South Korea, all over the Asia Pacific, Philippines, etc. That is all geared towards China. That's the pivot to Asia started under Obama that continues under Trump and Biden. And, again, Matt Duss ignores the sanctions that already exist on China, and there are many. So there's the sanctions on Huawei and ZTE and Chinese tech corporations. When it comes to certain imports, the tariffs are still there on U.S.-China trade, which are still harming the U.S. economy mainly. There's diplomatic sanctions in the Uyghur Human Rights and Policy Act, which was passed under Donald Trump at the tail end of his administration, which is about targeting Chinese officials, supposedly, mainly Communist Party officials. And then there's the sanctions that were just passed, as I said before, in the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which ban all imports from Xinjiang unless those corporations that are importing into the United States can prove that they weren't made by quote-unquote forced labor. Essentially, you have to prove a negative, and it's impossible to prove mainly because the forced labor, quote-unquote, doesn't exist, right? So I talk about in this article, too, the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, which is particularly insidious, not because of the sanctions it necessarily has on Hong Kong. That was the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, which sanctioned a lot of Hong Kong officials specifically. But preceding that, 2019, the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, what it did is it said that the president has to regularly review possible sanctions on Hong Kong. And one of the stipulations for that is whether Hong Kong is violating U.S. sanctions on Iran in the DPRK. So think about that. The United States is literally exercising extra-legal jurisdiction, totally against international law, in enforcing its own sanctions policy against a city in China, the Hong Kong Special Autonomous Region. Think about that. Anyway, that's just ridiculous. So, Klein's minimization of U.S. policy creates a false equivalency between the U.S. and China, a symptom of the pro-imperialist Cold War attitudes that continue to plague much of what calls itself the quote-unquote left in the U.S. and West. So I'm getting towards the end here, and I'm just going to interrupt real quick and just say, please subscribe, like, do all that good stuff, hit the notifications bell, and also, if you're able to, subscribe to my Patreon at patreon.com/Danny Haiphong, or you can do a yearly subscription on Substack at chroniclesofhaiphong.substack.com and help sustain this work, all the writing I'm doing, etc. So let me get back to this now. I'll just read the rest. It's only 3 paragraphs. So real leftists oppose their own government's warmongering policies, uphold international law, and pay proper attention to achievements of countries targeted by U.S. imperialism, such as China's elimination of extreme poverty. Real leftists investigate claims made by dubious sources backed by U.S. intelligence cutouts, such as the National Endowment for Democracy, rather than embrace them wholesale. Real leftists understand that the American empire is the biggest obstacle in the way of human progress. They don't ask what should the left do about China. They pose the question, how can the left develop solidarity with China and the Chinese people in the global struggle against imperialism and oppression of all kinds? So in the data publication, this is hilarious. Klein tweeted that he was, quote, the furthest thing from a China expert, end quote. And it really showed. His article contains no substance on the facts and criticisms that undergird left divisions on China. It was clear from the beginning that the purpose of the piece was to manufacture consent for a neither Washington nor Beijing position amongst the left. Champions of this formulation, as I said before, are generally more concerned with organizing and winning leftists over to an anti-China position rather than a pro-peace position. And here's the tweet right here. He's farthest from the China expert and didn't really try to become one in this article. So Klein uses human rights as a cudgel to smear leftists and satisfy the powerful forces of the American empire. Some of those forces being, right, the military-industrial complex, the corporate media, Joe Biden's administration, and essentially large sections of the population which have swallowed wholesale the new Cold War propaganda and view China as their enemy. His article offers little more than an assortment of Cold War talking points that masquerade as quote-unquote objective investigation. A political agenda was pursued from the start, and left challengers to the empire's narrative were demonized and dismissed. This is completely in line with the U.S.'s new Cold War on China and is reflective of the pro-empire mentality that continues to render the Western left an ineffective and counterproductive force in the global struggle for peace and socialism. So again, that was the article that I wrote on this Nation report. I'm going to stop sharing that now. So I usually do, I take audio, and so I'll make that into an audio clip for folks for Patreon and Substack. So if you don't want to read the article, because some folks are less inclined to read, you can essentially listen and do so in audio form, which is a little easier than video and when you're on the go. So with that said, yeah, so somebody said check out New Atlas with Brian Berlidick. I've actually been following Brian for a while when he was Tori Carlucci. Maybe it's someone I'll connect with soon. I really do enjoy his work, especially on the covert sort of operations, these counterinsurgency operations against countries like China, Russia, etc. So with that said, that's the article, that's the position. So someone on my Patreon said, well, what about it, that there is, hold on one second. Is my audio working? Can y'all hear me? I just want to make sure. That's really unfortunate. I've been using the mic from my laptop. Could you hear that? Okay. It says I sound fine. Hold on one second. I'm going to just pause. All right, hold on one second. All right, guys. Okay. That's unfortunate. All right. So people are saying it wasn't bad at all. Great. All right. Not as good as usual. That's fine. What are you gonna do? These things happen. I didn't have my regular mic. I thought this mic was plugged in. Hence, it was one of the things I forgot. Okay. So, yeah, that's the position. I don't know what dulcet tones are. Some folks are saying there's dulcet tones. Don't know what that is. I'm in a kind of a big apartment. It's hard to, have to spend a lot of money on soundproofing this place.
I'm married, and so there's also the aesthetics that come with audio stuff that is not great. All right, so the audio was good before. Thanks, everyone. I'm curious about it, but thanks for everyone for coming for that poor part of this. Still plenty of time, so I'm going to definitely move on to the Kazakhstan situation, give some comments on it, go over a little bit about my article on CGTN. I wanted, because it's related, right? Because it is issues like Kazakhstan that then become even more confusing when people like David Klyan smear China as this kind of human rights catastrophe with no appreciation for why China is on the rise and the US is on the decline. And it's so easy, given that the US's rise was so connected to imperialism. Well, it was really an outgrowth of imperialism, right? The US's rise to prominence as a hegemonic power. So easy to just project that onto China, especially when your leftism, your politics of international affairs and on international affairs are not rooted in study of them. It's all rooted in this sectarianism, this playing off certain sections of the left against each other, and it's all about reinforcing the Cold War McCarthyist divisions on the left rather than trying to seriously confront disagreements so we can have a more serious anti-war movement in the United States. The article doesn't do any of that. I mean, the fact that you could have someone as prominent as Matt Duss, someone, and that should be a real scandal here. I probably should have just spent the article writing about that. Because think about it. You have a prominent so-called advisor to Bernie Sanders, who many, unfortunately, I don't think this. I think Bernie Sanders is an imperialist pig, but many do believe Bernie Sanders is about peace. People appreciate his positions on Palestine, for example. They appreciate that, even though I think it's not going far enough, that he actually talks about Israel's crimes against the Palestinians. And so this is a growing problem, and it's one that I've confronted so many times in my time in my experience in the movement, right? Especially in the Palestinian solidarity movement, you do have a lot of forces in there, especially oriented towards more quote unquote Trotskyists, former ISO kind of organizations. A lot of these pseudo socialist organizations, which are all for Palestinian self determination. I mean, we'll see if Palestine ever wins that self-determination, where these left forces will fall then, so-called left forces will fall then, but they do not support Syrian self-determination. They don't support China's self-determination. Actually, what they hope for is that the US-backed rebels, US, Israel, Gulf countries, Turkey, they're so-called rebels, they're terrorists, they're Al-Qaeda affiliates, that they take power in Syria, that Nicaragua is overthrown by a neoliberal regime that just sounds better than a Pinochet, for example. That is essentially the politics of a lot of the left, and it's very unfortunate, and it's very damaging. And I mean, it's wholly racist. This is the kind of racism that doesn't get talked about, and everyone wants to come at me and say, "Danny, you're always talking about racism." Well, how can you talk about U.S. foreign policy without talking about racism? It's the highest form of racism to declare that you have the right to dictate what the Chinese people support and what they don't. The Chinese people support their government in numbers way over 90%, 95% of the Harvard Ash study, and a more recent study in the aftermath of a year plus of COVID-19, 98%, right? So who's David Klyan or Promise Lee or any of these forces? Who are they to dictate what the Chinese people support? Why is it that they're not advocating for the United States to withdraw its military apparatus, to withdraw its hostile sanctions, to end them, to end these diplomatic hostilities, and to engage in real cooperation around climate change, poverty alleviation, disarmament? Why not? Well, If you go on to, for example, go to Lao San's website, and you will find literal articles arguing why, although Taiwan forces and Hong Kong forces should be weary of U.S. support, that they should take it all the way up until they withdraw it, because it will be withdrawn because you can't trust the United States. Is that really a position? Sounds like you're just okay with the U.S. meddling in Taiwan's affairs, meddling in Hong Kong's affairs, meddling literally in China's affairs, because both are regions of China. Like, how could you support that? Anyway, well, you can support it when you're an opportunist and you support imperialism and it's beneficial for you, which it is, right? This is how people gain large followings. If I became anti-China tomorrow, started making videos about how bad China is, I'm sure this channel would blow up. I could frame it as, oh, I'm an Asian American who used to love China, now I hate it, and here's why. And I'm sure the algorithm would go. Phew. So I am going to talk about Kazakhstan now for the last half hour. So apologies, the audio is definitely changed, but you all seem to have, I didn't hear anyone complain about the audio in the beginning or anything. So yeah, let's move on. Let's continue. I want to talk about Kazakhstan. And before I do, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. So when I do come on, you can know, it's hard for me. I'm going to try to do once weekly. I'm going to try to get more guests. I'm working with some folks. I'm actually really excited to work with Hakeem maybe on their pod soon. Actually, a really cool thing coming out today. Go to Instagram, What Radicalized You. I did a podcast with them. So I've been doing some interviews with other folks as well, trying to balance that out a bit, because it is tough to manage a program. It is tough to manage all of this. And certainly the holidays did not make it easy. We had visitors for, I don't know, we had visitors for almost 2 weeks, and it freaked out the dog. And anyway, it was stressful. And it's harder to do this when you got visitors in a New York City apartment, I gotta say. All right. So somebody said the audio was sounding like tin. That's so frustrating. Um, anyway, regardless, let's talk about Kazakhstan. Let's move on. So Kazakhstan, January 2nd, blew up, right? Not literally, but unrest, right? Protests. And it was all around supposedly a singular policy, and that is gas gas subsidies were cut. Essentially a price cap on the price of gas, and supposedly this erupted large protests. And indeed there were protests over that. And in the former Soviet states, the Eastern European countries especially, but also in Central Asia, they've been racked with austerity. I mean, and real political instability, right? So the current president, Mr. What's his name now? Not a name we say very often, but the president of Kazakhstan, he came to power in 2019 after a lot of political turmoil, right? There was some regime, Kassym Jomart Tokayev. So he took over in 2019, and yeah, there's been political instability in Kazakhstan, and it's a byproduct of the fall of the Soviet Union, because these countries were not countries, right? There's been this like Kazakhstanification, trying to build this nationalism that doesn't really exist, mainly because it was a Soviet republic and these borders were literally drawn up by those folks who wanted to see the Soviet Union disintegrated. So it became the level of underdevelopment skyrocketed in Kazakhstan. And then China launched its Belt and Road Initiative and actually launched it in Kazakhstan. In 2013, the announcement by President Xi Jinping was made in this country as a symbol, right? Because Kazakhstan has a 1,700-kilometer border with China, and it was a symbol of that partnership, which was already burgeoning, but now has become so big that it is Kazakhstan's largest trading partner, with Russia in second. So this unrest was violent, right? Beginning January 2nd, people were getting killed. You had videos of unmarked cars giving weapons to folks. You had gunshots in government buildings. I think more than 100 people died, something like almost 120, maybe 119, I think. Thousands were arrested. Confrontations between the military and these quote unquote protesters, right? And the Kazakhstan government called upon the uh, security organization that was formed as a counterweight to NATO, uh, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which has Belarus, Tajikistan, uh, it has Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan. It has 6 countries of the region cooperating on security, and essentially the president, Tokayev, requested assistance. And since then, things have been stabilizing. The protests have been diminishing, and Tokayev announced, I think, a 6-month pause on the cut. So between that and the security cooperation, things are stabilizing. But all along the way, Vladimir Putin, Russia, Sergei Lavrov, Foreign Ministry, China, the president of Kazakhstan, Tokayev, they've all been saying that there are other elements involved here, that this is not just merely a domestic situation, and that we have to guard against color revolutions. And so that, I think, is very important. And so some people will say, well, what about the agency of the Kazakhstani people? And indeed, there is no doubt that there are domestic troubles in Kazakhstan, just like all of these countries which have literally been starved by the fall of the Soviet Union. I mean, that was such a brutal hit to landlocked countries like Kazakhstan, which were already underdeveloped to begin with, and now no longer had a direct lifeline in terms of sharing, cooperating, and developing with via the Soviet Union. When that was finished, then essentially Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, all these countries became open for business, and that's why you have some of the highest rates of poverty, despite having one of the most oil and gas rich countries in the world. I believe it's the largest oil producer in the Central Asia region. So I'm going to pull up my CGTN article because I think it's important to talk about what does U.S. meddling look like in some of its forms. I mean, this is by no means exhaustive because U.S. meddling is so expansive when it comes to the ways in which NGOs do their work. So I'm going to share my commission here, and then I'll share a short video. Actually, maybe I'll do that. I wanted to go over the WeChat article, but maybe I'll just put that in the chat here. The WeChat article is kind of long, but I'll put it in the chat because it does talk about some things that may be important. So actually, let's do that. Let's look at this WeChat article. You can find the CGTN article in CGTN. If you subscribe, you can to my Patreon, to my Substack. I'll be publishing it there as well. So I'm going to do that because I think it's good. You know, I don't know if many people are sharing WeChat sources. So luckily enough, I have some connections in China who can hook it up. And you have to have actually a certain level of literacy of both the Chinese language, of Mandarin, as well as the app. And so I have the app, but I had actually someone sent me this. So it says the darkest moment of the anchor of Central Asia's stability brings forth great revelations to the world, not fourth. So Kazakhstan is experiencing the biggest chaos in 30 years of independence. The changes are fast, the force is fierce, and the destruction is unexpected. Although the situation is stabilized recently, the dust is far from settled, and it remains to be seen where the former anchor of stability in Central Asia will go. As bystanders, we have at least 4 major revelations. So here we go. In the past few days, the militants who attacked government facilities, the ghosts of the United States in the West, are resorting to violent, peaceful demonstrations and constantly increasing the quote unquote people's demands. There are various signs that the frenzy of the color revolution is once again flocked to Central Asia. So essentially, this is a color revolution. As President Tokayev said, Kazakhstan has experienced the most difficult and darkest moment in its history of national independence. So here you are on January 6th, the statue of the former president, Nursultan Nazarbayev, was pulled down by protesters with a truck in Almaty. Almaty is very important in Kazakhstan as it is the most developed city. The most developed city, and also one which is hugely important to the Belt and Road Initiative. So on January 26, 2022, more than 1,000 protesters stormed the Almaty city government building and gunshots were heard at the scene. So this is a destroyed government building. I mean, protesters, generally peaceful demonstrations, don't really have that capacity. During the rebellion and so-called riots of 2020, you did have some institutions get burned and destroyed, but you had the police station in Minneapolis, for example. That was a huge moment. But by and large, this is a very difficult thing. And it's just so interesting that they had the weaponry to destroy this building. So we'll go on. So the United States and the West have repeatedly advocated that the color revolution can cure all diseases. Almost all Bayer shows in the world have been overturned. That must be a really bad translation. So it has been more than 10 years since the Arab Spring, and countries are still mired in an Arab winter of war, social unrest, economic recession. So in the once stable Ukraine and Bolivia, countless people were bloodstained on the streets in riots, and the country's reform and development were stagnated. So that is 100% true. Very good point. So again, this is coming out of China's WeChat. It's an independent writer talking about the unrest in Kazakhstan, comparing it to Ukraine and Bolivia. Those are two great examples. 2014 Ukraine, the overthrow by literal neo-Nazis supported by the United States, like the what are they called? The battalion. So these far-right forces in Ukraine, they overthrow the government in 2014 with the help of the United States. And then you have in Bolivia, far-right forces doing the same thing, right? That's essentially what happened. I think it's the Azov battalion. Am I correct there? The Azov battalion. Yeah, there we go. The Azov battalion. They're the far-right fascistic group. So that's what happened in Ukraine. And Bolivia had the same thing with the Jeanine Áñez administration being put into power, but a lot of far-right forces and the far-right Christian fundamentalist movement there, and they were empowered for luckily just a year. But we can go on. Syria is also another one, right? That's what they talk about, the quote-unquote Arab Spring. The National Endowment for Democracy, as we'll get into later, actually funds a lot of so-called civil society organizations in Syria as these fighters are being supplied with weapons and funding by the CIA and the Pentagon, sometimes conflicting with each other. As these al-Qaeda forces are being supported, so too are these more soft power tactics being employed to try to give legitimacy to them. I mean, look at the white helmets. That was a big example of that. And so the lessons of blood have proved that the color revolution signed on by the United States and the West have never been an express ticket for democracy and advancement, but an empty promise to chaos and decay. Very, very powerful. So in recent years, in order to promote global hegemony and suppress quote-unquote non-Chinese races such as China and Russia, the United States, I don't know what translation that is. That must be a super bad translation. So scratch that. In order to promote global hegemony against China and Russia, the United States has accelerated its strategic eastward shift, using Central Asia as a pawn to contain and restrain China and Russia. In 2020, after U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo visited Central Asian countries, including Kazakhstan, the United States immediately released a new version of the Central Asia strategy, full of private goods such as the rule of law reform, democracy and human rights, and promotion of American investment. So in my article, I talk about how $61 million in 2020 was invested by U.S. International Agency for National Development, the State Department, and affiliated organizations, $1 million in that year alone from the National Endowment for Democracy, funding all of these groups, so-called American investment, really trying to be a bulwark against the Belt and Road Initiative. So under the hard work of the United States and the West, false information, rumors, and slander spread all over Kazakhstan's network, in European standards, quote unquote, have become the golden rule that everyone should follow. Finally, amid the roar of American and Western public opinion and propaganda machinery, Kazakhstan was in chaos overnight, and the fruits of the hard work accumulated by generations of people were destroyed. There are public opinions that the riots have set back Kazakhstan's economy by at least 15 years. So think about this. I was reading an interview earlier today from a Kazakhstan academic published in 2016 that about only 5% of highways are Class A, or the highest uh, in the best condition. And that's one thing China is helping Kazakhstan do, is build roads, build infrastructure. And so there's a lot of enthusiasm about the Belt and Road Initiative. But so when you have 5% of roads being in top condition, the rest not, your economy is already really fragile. And so when you have forces destroying important institutions, it can really cause a lot of damage. So in the past 2 years, the National Endowment for Democracy has nearly doubled its funding to Kazakhstan. According to incomplete statistics, there are at least 16,000 NGOs of various types active in Kazakhstan, most of which of Western backgrounds. According to Russian media, the actual number of NGOs in Kazakhstan may be even as high as 40,000. So 40,000 organizations in this small country. I think it's a population of 19 million. Yes, considering that population of Kazakhstan is just over 19 million, so many NGOs supported by the West are enough to infiltrate Kazakhstan. I mean, it's a small country. So 40,000 organizations, you can really have an influence. Is this good for Kazakhstan, or is it trying to buy people's hearts and minds? That's definitely supposed to be minds, not conspiracy. It's not difficult to explain why a large number of democracy fighters who took money to break the law appeared in this riot. A Kyrgyz man detained in Almaty admitted to the media that someone offered him more than $200 USD, by the way. So that's not sure what the Kazakh currency is, but I'm sure it's a lot of money in this region, to go to Kazakhstan and participate in a protest, as well as buy air tickets to provide him with travel expenses. Many rioters from other countries have also received the same promise. They took to the streets under the arrangement of the unified organization. Some people also received energy drinks distributed uniformly. After drinking, they lost their behavior and ability to control themselves. That's interesting. This is reminiscent of Hong Kong, China. In those days, Western NGOs instigated thugs to commit crimes and openly issued wage slips to set salary standards for atrocities, such as smashing, assaulting police in Ignition. Now, the same drama is being played out in Kazakhstan. So there is a parallel here, because the U.S. National Endowment for Democracy is a huge funder of organizations that were operating in Hong Kong that are now being clamped down on because they broke the law by doing all of this chaos and violence toward people and institutions. And so they're being clamped down on. But in 2019, this was a huge problem. And so there is a big parallel there. The Western capital behind democracy is also searching for fat in Kazakhstan and enriching its own pockets. The United States once injected huge sums of money into the key energy industry of Central Asian countries under the banners of helping countries in social governance and passing advanced management experience, creating a group of new oligarchs too big to fail and grabbing all of the benefits. For example, Tengiz Chevron, a joint venture between the United States and Kazakhstan, is the largest entity and oil producer in Kazakhstan and controls a number of oil fields in Western Kazakhstan. Two American giants, Chevron and ExxonMobil, have 75% stake in the company, which is absolutely dominant. At the end of last year, Tengiz Chevron needed to lay off 40,000 Kazakh workers due to revenue. The fuse of this riot was precisely the protest of these oil workers because of their difficult lives. Well, I didn't know that, so I didn't actually read this all the way through. So these are just some of the details that we can't have, our media doesn't tell us about, right? They don't tell us about the damaging policies set forth by multinational corporations of the United States and the West in these countries. We don't hear that. Antony Blinken didn't say any of this. He didn't say that their corporations are responsible for destroying the livelihoods of 40,000 people before this unrest. He didn't say that. It's all about China and Russia. What did he say about Russia? Oh, it's hard to get them out once you allow them in your house. The Chinese security, the central, the organization that was called in, the what's it called? The Collective Security Treaty Organization, the Central Asian Russian Security Organization, is already leaving. It's ridiculous to say that, in fact, Russia doesn't leave. So anyway, moving on. So when the economic lifeline of a country is in the hands of the United States and the West, the flow of resources is determined by the Americans. The people of the country can get a share of the pie, and the answer can be imagined. So that's really bad translation. But essentially what this is said is that Kazakhstan's economy, a lot of it is dictated by the United States. As the largest seller of democracy and human rights, the United States has clearly marked the price of democracy and human rights time and time again, deceiving buyers into bankruptcy. But it is the only one who is full of money. President Tokayev reflected in this televised speech the tragic event. This tragic event has given us a new perspective on democracy and human rights. So this is a big deal. There's always blowback to color revolutions. So the strategy is to try to create enough instability, like in Ukraine, to get an overthrow of the government. It's been tried in Venezuela. It's been tried in Belarus. It's been tried in Hong Kong. It's been tried in so many places. Try to destabilize things to assert U.S. influence after the fact. Well, during the color revolution, there's an assertion of U.S. influence, but it's about ensuring that that country or that region is now split, is now separate, and can be dictated by U.S. forces, economic, military, political, diplomatic, etc., etc. But there's always blowback. Look what happened in Hong Kong. The national security law is doing a clean sweep. There's stability there. There were legislative elections held. The national security law is a raging success, very popular among people in Hong Kong because, surprise, surprise, people do not want their governments burning down. They don't want to be shot at with flaming arrows from the train station. They don't want to be attacked in the streets for a camera opportunity, a photo opportunity. People don't want that. And the same goes for Belarus, right? The same goes for the numerous times Russia has been involved in targeted by color revolutions. The same goes for Bolivia. It seems like the instability, whether it succeeds for a short time or not, does tend to have this blowback of creating more isolation for the United States and the West and its forces. And so I think we're going to see that with Kazakhstan after this experience. Kazakhstan was already a deep partner of China and Russia, and that will probably accelerate. And there will probably be even more cooperation on this issue alone because China and Russia have been cooperating together on color revolutions. But with Belt and Road Initiative, with the Eurasian Economic Union, there's an impetus to cooperate wholesale politically across the region on this matter. So shortly after the riot, President Tokayev characterized the incident as a terrorist attack and stated there would be no negotiation with terrorists and the thugs must be eliminated. On the other hand, Western populations have always avoided the word terrorism. What are the facts? Historically, Kazakhstan has had no shortage of protests, but it has never sparked such large-scale unrest, let alone a threat to regime security. Many Kazakhs said in interviews what happened to their motherland was unexpected. We thought the country was very prosperous, strong, and stable. In fact, the reason why this riot was so powerful and caused such heavy losses is precisely because a large number of violent terrorists caused mischief. They were planned and organized to provoke riots in many places simultaneously, and their methods were extremely brutal, even beheading the captured police soldiers. If these are not acts of terrorism, what are? I mean, that's disgusting. So here you have protesters in the city of Almaty were taken to the rally and uniformly distributing weapons. So there you see weapons being picked up off the ground. And here is a group of demonstrators snatch a policeman's firearm on the streets of Almaty. So, you're getting some of this feel. A retail store in the city of Almaty was looted by demonstrators. I mean, Now that's real looting. What happened in the 2020 rebellion in the United States across the country? That nothing compared to this. It is worth pondering that many violent terrorists have hidden a large number of deadly weapons and explosives beforehand. There is no, and are also proficient in using automatic rifles and police equipment. There's no doubt that they are not amateurs who take to the streets to protest on a whim. The composition of their personnel is very complex, including not only NGO people, but also Kazakh ultranationalists and Islamic extremist elements, and many others who are unidentified, but they've obviously received training from abroad. This movement of people and things is undoubtedly a huge threat to public safety, but the Kazakh security services have no warning. In the early days of the riots, some military and police officers had insufficient intelligence and went to the scene without weapons. As a result, the violent terrorists who were armed to the teeth were caught off guard and suffered heavy losses. So I think that's what's supposed to say, is that the police and the military were caught off guard. They didn't have weapons, and the protesters did. If the powerful departments do not have good information, the guns are not hard. How can they protect the people? And also one thing about Tokayev is that actually the military and police are from the former administration, who's an opponent of Tokayev. So that could have explained the miscommunication. For a long time, three evil forces: violent terrorist forces, ethnic supremacist forces, religious extremist forces, including the East Turkestan elements, have always been major concerns to Central Asian countries, posing a serious threat to regional peace, stability, and security development. The unrest in Kazakhstan is the latest proof. The world is waking up from a dream. If you hadn't experienced it and seen it with your own eyes, it would be hard to imagine that the violent terrorists are so brutal and inhumane. More and more people are finally understanding the need for the Chinese government to vigorously carry out counterterrorism and de-radicalization in Xinjiang, and understand the extreme importance, severity, and complexity of the fight against terrorism. On the contrary, some countries in the United States and the West, some countries like the United States and Western countries, out of selfish interest, not only support and condone violent extremists and terrorists to devastate Central Asia and the Middle East, but also frequently detain Xinjiang, frequently talk about Xinjiang, such as genocide and forced labor, which is nothing short of a shame for human civilization. So I think what it's saying here is that, what the author is saying here is that they talk about Xinjiang as this great human rights catastrophe, when in fact the US and the West support terrorism. So almost finished, I believe. Okay, so it continues onward, but where was I? Kazakhstan has long pursued the diverse and balanced foreign policy of great powers and failed to maintain sufficient vigilance against the Trojan horse of the United States and the West, and ultimately swallowed the consequences. It's a pretty good critique of an ally, I must say. Again, this is an independent article. This is not written by state media. So, for example, the Kazakh government agreed with the United States to establish a biological laboratory in its territory, and as a result, many strange diseases appeared there. According to reports, even the Kazakh officials have no right to ask what the Americans are doing in the laboratory. No wonder former Deputy Defense Minister Arnebek Togasov lamented, "We are like experimental monkeys, and our territory has become a natural testing ground for the Pentagon to test new viruses." Now, tell me that's not interesting. I mean, this is just a constant problem for oppressed countries like Kazakhstan, where their countries are just used as possible testing grounds, training grounds for the Pentagon. It's a complete violation of sovereignty, but the author is saying the Kazakhstan government has a balanced approach to all countries, Russia, China, the United States, and is suffering the consequences for allowing the US so much influence in Europe too. At a critical moment in Kazakhstan, the Chinese leader immediately sent a message, so Xi Jinping, reiterating to Tokayev, "Chinese people will always stand by the Kazakh people." State Councilor Wang Yi spoke with the Deputy Prime Minister of Kazakhstan on January 10th, the National Day of Mourning in Kazakhstan, expressing firm support for Kazakhstan in maintaining stability and ending violence. Russia and other members of the Collective Security Treaty Organization also supported the Kazakh authorities for the first time and sent peacekeeping forces to Kazakhstan to help Kazakhstan fight terrorism and maintain stability. On the other hand, the U.S. Embassy and Consulate website in Kazakhstan warned unpredictably that there might be unrest in Kazakhstan and immediately withdrew all kinds of NGOs in Almaty, throwing away the Kazakh people who were dreaming of the American dream in their heads, who had this idea of the American dream. On the other hand, Western governments watched the fire from the sidelines after the incident, condemning Kazakhstan's quote unquote authoritarian, strong, and repressive. So, condemning Kazakhstan's government. Reuters, BBC, and other media hyped up Kazakh president's order to kill and suppress the riots, quote unquote, and shooting without warning. Secretary of State Blinken, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, said, when the Russians come in your house, it is very difficult to let them leave. The result was immediately scolded. This quote was immediately scolded by Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zakharova. When the Americans come to your house, you either die or be captured by adultery. So that I remember that. That was a very funny quote. So faced with the crisis of life and death, it is clear at a glance who is the true friend and who is the grandmother wolf. Interesting. I believe that this is an unforgettable lesson that will allow Kazakh authorities and people to recognize that the true force of the United States and the West, see clearly the black hands that are eager to move under the cloak of democracy and human rights in the United States and the West, and finally realize that playing ambiguous with the US and the West is playing with fire. Now, that is some advice. So the future generations mourn and do not learn from it. And it also makes future generations mourn for the future generations. So that seems like a broken quote, mistranslation. So when the future generations mourn and do not learn from it, it also makes future generations mourn for the future generations. So essentially dooming the future to the condition of the present. Kazakhstan has already come to a painful conclusion. The new government has taken office, but the United States and the West behind the scenes are still stirring the undercurrent. For most countries in the world, Kazakhstan's darkest hour is the most vivid and cruel public lesson in 2022, which is worth thinking about, being cautious about, and learning from. So this was written by Xiaoyang Xiaosha, and it's about, so the WeChat publication is on the international situation, breaking the news, current politics and events, I think. So anyway, I wanted to share that with you. I hope that you found that interesting. Oops, let me just stop the screen. I hope you found that interesting. You know, essentially it's basically what I wrote in my article, a lot of it talking about the role of NGOs, the exertion of soft power. That's their role. So they are another force for intervention. They're another force of the U.S. empire. It's in its European allies, right? These Western NGOs, U.S.-based NGOs, they're meant to shape hearts, minds. They're meant to alter economic, political, social, cultural relations in the country, to steer a country like Kazakhstan into the U.S. camp, again, because the Belt and Road Initiative is threatening U.S. hegemony in so many ways, but mainly through replacing the U.S.'s and the West's financial institutions with a more stable and more helpful alternative, which is China's ability to invest in infrastructure and to do so in a way that does not produce what we saw in Kazakhstan over the last couple of weeks, this instability, unrest. You don't get that through investment in ports and roads and railroads and high-speed rail. And you don't get that. You don't get that through stadiums and hospitals and 5G technology, bases, telecommunications, infrastructure, all of that. Building that won't create the unrest that we saw in Kazakhstan, which is a definite byproduct of all of the underdevelopment that exists there since the fall of the Soviet Union. So that's how history is intertwined, right? You had the US playing monopolist after the fall of the Soviet Union. The principal imperialist power no longer had a socialist challenger and literally ran roughshod over the entire region, pressured shock therapy everywhere, austerity everywhere, militarized the region, expanded NATO, and Kazakhstan paid a heavy price through the level of underdevelopment that exists there despite all of the resources that it has. Now, China is offering an alternative in the Belt and Road Initiative, and those relations are pretty solid at this point, and they're not going to reverse, no matter how much the US and West want that. It's not going to reverse. And this is how the United States and the West ultimately repay these countries that are doing business with China. So every single one of these countries that is in the Belt and Road Initiative is potentially subject to this kind of unrest as almost a domino theory, right? That's why we saw Belarus in 2020. That's why there's talks of Moldova now. That's why we seem to have every couple months, 6 months, every short period of time, we have another target. And that's only going to grow because we see Nicaragua has entered the Belt and Road Initiative. Syria, this is a big deal. Syria and Nicaragua, two countries that, while not as developed as China, certainly sit in the same camp internationally in the sense that both of them are for and abide by international law. Both of them consider themselves fiercely sovereign and independent. And both of them have histories of being targeted by the West in such a way that makes China only that much more attractive because China not only shares a common history in that way, but also is willing to cooperate on a far different basis. You will not see China go after Daniel Ortega and say, you got to overthrow that government, got to get him out of power. Same thing with Bashar al-Assad in Syria. No, China will help Syria rebuild after the war. China will help Nicaragua subvert sanctions and be able to survive and stabilize and thrive in a very particularly difficult economic environment. And so Kazakhstan only serves to benefit and has benefited already from cooperation with China. That's why you had the quote in that article saying that Kazakhstan, there was some surprise by this unrest because there has been steady progress in that way. There has been more economic development, more modernization, and it's going to continue. But we can expect that these tens of thousands of NGOs in that country and all those NGOs that are spread all across the world, sucking resources dry from these countries, infiltrating them politically, creating all this instability at the behest of US and Western capital and its military apparatus, we can expect that that will continue as well. So that's Kazakhstan, folks. It's a complex situation. It has nothing to do with Borat, nothing to do with the Orientalist understanding of the former Soviet republics. It's everything to do with how we oppose imperialism here. Because the only way we can understand better the situation abroad is, yeah, we can do our own investigation and we can try to understand the political situation in these countries. And we can maybe do a decent job, but really you got to have some cultural exchanges. And we're far away from that. The United States, the left, first of all, is not organized enough to do this on a regular basis. So they tend to focus on very key areas with some history. Like there's a lot of delegations that you can find to go to Cuba. But there are less when it comes to China, when it comes to Central Asia, when it comes to the DPRK. There's some friendship associations, but it's very difficult nonetheless. So that's the best way, is to build a strong left here to oppose aggression of all kinds by the United States abroad, whether it's covert, overt, whether it's soft power, hard power, doesn't matter. We have to oppose it and we have to organize around it. We have to make it relevant for the people, the workers, the oppressed here, right here in the United States. And it is very relevant because that kind of aggression speaks volumes about what kind of society we live in and how we experience the United States' brutal imperialist, white supremacist, and capitalist system. I mean, there's the very basic premise that, yes, involvement in Kazakhstan militarily through these covert ops drains resources from the United States that could be used on things like filling these millions of homes with actual people, rebuilding infrastructure, et cetera. Build back better. That's what Joe Biden says, right? And all of his hangers on. But there's also the bigger reflection of what militarism and these covert ops really say about the United States, which is that the United States actually is not prepared or organized or built to address the needs of humanity, to address the needs of the working class, of the oppressed. Actually, it's designed and built to keep the exploitation of the masses intact in all ways that it can. And in this period, there aren't even talks of reforms that will stabilize the situation, let alone bring progress to the people. So you can't even get a military policy that will focus on stability. There were some people that hoped that Joe Biden's policy towards China would regain some stability there. That has not happened at all, right? The exact opposite is true. And the same goes for the domestic situation. There's no political and economic reforms, quote unquote, that even are being discussed seriously, which will improve the lives of the people. And don't even get me started with Build Back Better, because that's a pipe dream at this point. Joe Biden doesn't want it. Kamala Harris doesn't really want it. The whole Democratic Party doesn't really want it. The majority is so slim, and the whole rotating villains thing is not really convincing. It really is all about playing the masses long enough so when they finally do respond, it doesn't have any impact on the elections. Now we're seeing it probably will have an impact on the elections in the negative for the Democrats, but that's why we have to dump the duopoly, because neither the Republicans nor Democrats serve the interests of the workers, serve the interests of the masses of people. So that's what I got, guys. It was good to be with all of you. Maybe I'll go through some of these chats. If you are still here, consider subscribing to my Patreon at patreon.com/Danny Haiphong. Help support this work, support these articles, support these streams and all the work that I'm doing in between. And be sure to hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. And yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's been any questions that you all got. I'm looking through these chats. I'll probably how important is the Nation magazine in 2022? Seriously, sounded like a rhetorical question. Not very important. I really haven't read the Nation magazine unless it comes out with one of these pieces, because it just doesn't have any quality analysis at this point. It's a lot of posturing, elitism, really liberal elitism. And then of course there's a suggestion for Brian Berletic. I will remember that. I'll write them down so I can eventually do a collaboration. And then here's all the audio stuff. Again, apologies. People seem to not mind the laptop mic. It said a tad echoey was all great. Let's see. It says Brian Berletic and his guests have a weekly show called Inflection. Maybe you jump in with him. Good suggestion. I'll write that down. I like his stuff. I would like to collaborate with them. I'm trying to collaborate with some of these other expats in China, or who have worked in China as well, because I think there's something valuable about. I mean, Daniel Dumbrell is already so involved in terms of activism and whatnot, but I think there's some involvement to cross pollinate there as well, to get that crowd involved in the peace movement. Not to say that they aren't, but maybe their audiences could be more involved. So I don't see any questions here. So maybe I'm going too fast. All right. So that's all, folks. It's good to be with all of you. We did more than an hour and a half today. Thanks for coming. So we got one question. I'll let Dylan ask it, but it was good to be with all of you. I'll answer this question. I'll peace out. Yeah. So subscribe, hit the like button, all that good stuff. I enjoyed this, I think it's good to review these articles. And yeah, it's important, continue onward in this work. the discouragement, I've had some levels of discouragement lately, so I've been trying to refocus, recenter. With Omicron and all this nonsense, it's hard to like really connect. I've been pretty disenchanted with the narrative around COVID, so I don't even touch that. I mean, first of all, I touched that on YouTube, and I'm, I might get canceled. I don't think my view on it would really be cancelable given the parameters of what is unacceptable, I guess. But my position still on COVID is the same as it's been since January 2020. And that was, let's see what China's doing, and let's see how much we can fight towards something as close to that model as possible. Didn't work. Didn't happen. Actually, the exact opposite has happened. Now we have such a dismissal of zero COVID in China's policy that most people are on the let's just forget about all this. We don't need to do anything restrictive. It's all about freedom. And I have my critiques certainly of the mishmash, the repressive ways in which restrictions are implemented, but nonetheless, I don't see why we wouldn't be calling for real public health measures, real government measures. If we had a real government that served the people here, right? Why wouldn't we be pushing those contradictions? That's really my opinion on COVID, but it's been so hard to even listen to all this because I've had friends who have family died of it. I've had my wife, she's been exposed to it so much in the hospitals, and yeah, I can't take the minimization. It's just too much. And so I've had actually some people leave over that position. Leave my Patreon, not Substack, but leave my Patreon over that. It's really weird. It's like there's this hardline politicization of COVID, which I don't understand one bit. But maybe I'll do a whole stream about my position on COVID, and get my channel, get this channel eliminated, suppressed. All right. So the question Dylan asked, I saw it. Dylan. So he asked about Ben Noor and talked about the unrest in Kazakhstan has made the new president talk about reforms. Well, I think the article that I read in WeChat from China talked about that a little bit, talking about reconceptualizing what human rights is. And I think that the reforms are mainly going to be about security. I think there's going to be more security cooperation. That's what I've heard, more security cooperation around these kind of color revolution activities. And it's sort of a lesson because the military, as I said before, is under the former administration, which is an opponent of the current one. So there's some power conflict there, and that could lead to something like collaboration between these forces and the military, which causes, of course, as we've seen in we've seen in other governments, not just divisions, but it could lead to disaster. There's a reason why Venezuela, for example, has been able to maintain power for so long, despite all of the pressures. Same with Nicaragua. The military isn't in the hands of their opponents. That's why it's just such a big lesson that if you're under threat from imperialism, you cannot, I repeat, you cannot allow imperialism to infiltrate the armed forces, police, military. If you do, then you will be likely overthrown. I mean, that was a lesson of Chile, right? Chile did not have control of its military under Allende. And so September 11, 1973, the CIA was able to take advantage of that. And that's why it's one of the reasons why the coup was successful. So I wouldn't be surprised in order to maintain the stability of the government if the reforms would focus on security and focus on cooperating with those countries like the Collective Security Treaty Organization and Russia, China, for example, on some sort of cooperation that allows for the economic growth side to be secure, right? So that just makes sense to me. And, there's a question about smear VJ. I just think that whenever you talk to people like our David Klein and then the Nation editors, if you come from a certain political uh, orientation to the left, a communist, it's almost par for the course that you're going to be misquoted, misinterpreted, misrepresented, that your words are going to be chopped up and fit into a narrative. That's kind of what it is. That's the risk you take. I mean, I'll tell you a story. Vice actually asked, for some reason, they were suggesting one of my social media profiles and said, "Oh, maybe you'll be in our documentary about anti-Asian racism." When I told them about my position on anti-Asian racism being connected to anti-China politics, and the new Cold War and imperialism, I didn't get a call back. But I was a little fearful, right, that my words would be used in some way. I asked them about it. I also made sure that my words were spoken in such a manner that there was no question about where I stood on any of these issues. So I think we have to be very careful because they're not going to be careful. And so I think this is a lesson, not to say VJ wasn't careful. I didn't see the transcript. I'm leaning towards the nation not doing its due diligence to ensure that his opinion, because I know VJ's politics on China, and so I just think it's a reflection of how these institutions treat people like us. And we always have to be weary of that, despite the fact that we want to reach people. So we should try. We should try. We should try to reach people. Um, so let's see. Somebody said, "Don't touch COVID." And I'm not. I'm not. Uh, is it fair to say that there are effectively no Vietnamese communists in the USA because they were all assassinated? Not sure what you mean by that. I mean, I think that for the most part, those who emigrated from Vietnam were not members of the Communist Party of Vietnam, were not affiliated with the National Liberation Front. They were more so outside of that or on the side of the landlord class. So I think that's what explains that. Not sure about that question though. So, all right, guys, just gonna keep going. Thanks for coming. I'm gonna head out. If you haven't yet, like the stream, subscribe to the channel, hit the notifications bell. And if you can't support my work, you can do so at patreon.com/Danny Haiphong on a monthly basis and chroniclesofhaiphong.substack.com on a yearly basis. Peace out, everyone. Until next time.